Art History and Cultural Studies. I'd like to welcome those here and those who are on Zoom to a panel on climate justice, past, present, futures, co-hosted by the CHR and the Institute for Sustainable Earth with generous support from Mason's Cultural Studies PhD program and the School of Integrated Studies. The Center for Humanities Research was chartered in September of 2020 as one of Mason's 5 transdisciplinary research centers for advanced study. As a university center, part of our mission is to build bridges out of the humanities to other disciplines. And the issue of climate justice provides us the opportunity to do precisely this kind of work, to engage in dialogue and intellectual collaboration across intellectual and institutional boundaries. In fact, the idea for this emerged out of the CHR Environmental Justice Reading Group. Our hope was that in creating interdisciplinary, thematically organized reading groups, we'd bring together faculty and students from across a range of disciplines who would have the opportunity to talk and think with one another across those disciplinary boundaries. And this has indeed begun to happen. When Todd Stafford and Levi Van Sant came to us with the idea for this event, which works so well with our annual theme, Past, Present, Futures, we jumped at the opportunity and reached out to our colleagues at the ISE, the Institute for a Sustainable Earth, who were equally excited. You'll hear more about our distinguished panelists shortly, but first, I'd like to turn the floor over to Professor Leah Nichols, who is the Executive Director of George Mason University's Institute for a Sustainable Earth. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nichols, who will introduce the event.
So you can hear me. As Alison said, my name is Leah Nichols, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Sustainable Earth, where we are working to build connections across academic units, across disciplines, and with external partners in order to put science into action in support of a just, prosperous, and sustainable world. I'm delighted to be co-sponsoring this event with the Center for Humanities Research at Levi and the working group. Because this is exactly what we're trying to do. We want to build bridges between different disciplines and bring all of our efforts together to solve the grand challenges that face us. Climate change and climate justice is one of the most significant. In this panel, very exciting, very fascinating. I think will be a very fascinating conversation. We're bringing together. Let's see, what should I say? There's a growing sense as climate change. We're facing climate change. There's a growing sense that the present is more constrained by the past, more so than ever right now. And that's what we brought these panelists together, and Levi will introduce them to you, so that we can explore that. How do the pasts and the actions that we took in the past shape our future, our current, our present, and what types of actions we can take going forward in order to address climate change. So now let me turn it over to Levi. Levi Van Sant is a professor in the School of Integrated Studies, and he is a human geographer that focuses on environmental justice or justice. Take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's really great to be here. Thanks to Dr. Landsberg and Dr. Nichols for all of their work, and the Center for Humanities Research, as well as the Institute for Sustainable Earth for all of this work and helping us organize this and pulling it all together, as well as the School for Integrative Studies and the Department of Cultural Studies. I want to give a special thanks to Catherine Oline and Todd Stafford, who have done a lot of the behind the scenes work necessary to get all of this done. So thanks to both of you. And I also want to give a special welcome to student members of Pi Gamma Mu, the National Honor Society, who are joining us today. Thanks for coming. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce the panelists. We're very lucky to have here today 3 exciting scholars to help us think through this. First, to my right, Dr. Jamie Haverkamp, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at James Madison University. And obviously we'll get a lot more from these folks about their work, but briefly, Dr. Haverkamp's work analyzes collaborative adaptation struggles in the Peruvian Andes, adaptation to climate change. And she focuses on the tensions between highland campesinos, NGOs, and government officials. So some of the nitty-gritty, everyday, and institutional aspects of this. And so building from this sustained ethnographic work, Her book project advances a decolonial vision of adaptation otherwise, a provocative concept, which hopefully we'll dig into more today. You can find her publications in Environment and Planning A, World Development, and elsewhere. Next down the line, we have Dr. Kai Bosworth, an assistant professor of international studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. And Dr. Bosworth's book is coming out any day now, maybe next month, titled Pipeline Populism, Affective Infrastructures of Grassroots Environmentalism in the 21st Century. That's with University of Minnesota Press. And in this book, Dr. Bosworth examines the possibilities and limitations of fossil fuel pipeline opposition movements in the central US, mainly around Keystone and the Dakota Access pipelines. And more specifically, he focuses on people-powered movements that aim to bring together a diverse set of constituencies, from indigenous water protectors to urban environmentalists and Midwestern farmers. So this is also an exciting opportunity for us to think about that kind of coalition building and sort of, again, everyday politics that's crucial to thinking about climate change and climate justice. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Olufemi Taiwo, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. And his work draws from the Black radical tradition, the social sciences, as well as materialist thought. And his first book, Reconsidering Reparations, which came out earlier this year, he develops what he calls a constructive or a forward-looking vision of reparations, one that aims to dismantle the legacies of slavery and colonialism while also saving the planet from climate crisis, right? So this is obviously some of the big picture questions that we need to grapple with as well. Dr. Taiwo has also published in popular outlets, The Guardian, The Nation, many others. And his next book is coming out as well in any day now, in the next couple of months. Elite Capture, How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. So thanks for joining us today. So to get us started, I'd like to just give each of you an opportunity to tell us a little bit more about your research projects, how you came to them, and how they connect to the theme of climate justice. If you can just ground us a little bit more in your particular research project.
May I start?
Sure.
So I'm Jamie Camp. Yeah, I've been working in the Peruvian Andes for, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years now, with a little hiatus on the pandemic. And my returns there. Really, I went there as a graduate student, as a doctoral student, interested in understanding adaptation to climate change. I'm working in an Andean region where there's over 6,000 tropical glaciers, so they're melting at an alarming rate. And campesinos, so small agricultural communities that I work with here, pastoralist communities, are directly impacted by the lack of water or the changes in water flow from the melting glaciers. So I work in the Cordillera Blanca. The mountains have their name from the white glaciers, the concentration of white glaciers there. I was interested to understand both how climate change was, affecting everyday lives of campesinos, and then also the responses to it, right? And when I came to the project, I realized that the struggle to adapt to climate change was not so much a struggle to adapt to climate impacts as it was to a colonial legacy in the Andes. And so the way that colonization manifests in the climate crisis with new ways of territorialization and green grabbing and notions of tenuous land tenure, right? Climate change is kind of destabilizing the hold the traditional homelands of the campesinos that I work with, descendants of the Inca, right? And creating new logics through adaptation planning for land capture by the state in the name of adaptation, right? And so I realized that project to study climate change was really going to be a project to study the colonial legacies here and neo-colonial adaptation actions. So at one point, my project took a few years to kind of deconstruct the kind of top-down project of climate adaptation that's displacing campesinos from their lands. And then we turned into a really constructivist project with participatory action research and working with campesinos after establishing several years relations with them and having an ask of me on behalf of the community to maybe engage in a way that is going to be beneficial to the community, right? So at that point, we began doing community workshops for adaptation, kind of grassroots organizing, 240 agropastoralists in the valley that I'm working in. Co-learning how a place-based, a community-led adaptation vision, a model of what's going to be viable for the community and not using really these kind of technocratic ideas of what should be here. So that's where we're at, and that's kind of pushing me into the space of imagining adaptation otherwise, right? Or kind of a decolonial take on adaptation.
Thank you.
I'm going next.
Go for it.
You didn't tell me that you were going to ask this question. Now I'm trying to think about how I can do the short version, because I do have a long version. So the short version of how I came to be interested in pipeline politics and climate politics is that I was a young person growing up in South Dakota, and I heard about this climate change thing, and it freaked me the fuck out. And I went to school, and went to college, and I was like, I keep learning about this, but I actually want to do something about it. So I got involved at a young age in like 2007 or 2008 in what at that time we called the youth climate movement, which was, kind of like a lot of students and young people, some even high school students around the country who were interested in pressuring leaders and even politicians and even the leaders of environmental NGOs to care about climate change, and that to have a climate politics meant that we had to do things like stop building coal plants and build just transitions and all this kind of stuff. So I was really heavily involved in environmental and young people organizing in this period of time up until around 2009, when it really felt like we hit a wall with this sort of strategy. So, at the time, we thought that if we pressured our politicians and elected Barack Obama, we would get like some kind of climate policy, and that would do the thing to make the just climate world. At the same time, at the international level, there were people doing this at the Council of Parties meetings in Copenhagen, trying to create and put in climate justice principles into the kinds of agreements that were being hashed out by, again, politicians and elites, really. And both of those attempts were colossal failures. The Obama administration and the Senate, despite having supermajority, kind of like half-heartedly tried climate change and then said, well, we can't really do this. And the Copenhagen Agreement in 2009 was even more voluntary, even less sort of binding than other sorts of policy agreements. And so we were doing a kind of climate politics at the time that attempted to try to build transformation by like lobbying and studying policy and this kind of stuff. And at that point, I and certainly many others were just like, okay, we're doing the wrong thing. Like, we've got to go back to the drawing board and think about what we're doing wrong and like how we can actually build a kind of power mass movement of some kind to ally with others around the world to try to get something radical and transformative and actually just in the climate world happening. And so again, long story short, there was also this incredible financial recession. I was in debt from going to school, so I was like, oh, I can just go to graduate school and defer my loans for 10 years, and then maybe things will be different in 10 years. And in the meantime, maybe study and learn from what other people are trying elsewhere. And so I had grown up, as I said, in South Dakota, and I began to learn about kind of like emerging coalitions and opposition to oil pipelines from the tar sands that were going through my state. And I said, well, okay, maybe I can go back and study and contribute to this movement and struggle with these people and consider in what way Native nations are bringing their leadership to these struggles, and how settlers, non-Indigenous people like myself are either learning or not learning from the sorts of politics that they were participating in. So again, and I can kind of talk about like what I think and like who I study. I mean, I guess as a project, what my work is, what I do as a geographer is study how settlers, how non-Indigenous people grapple with trying to produce a transformative, universalizing climate justice project, while also, you know, sometimes kind of like stepping on rakes and kind of like putting their foot in their mouth and like not quite getting all of it and just fumbling around, which is what politics is, to try to build that more just world. And yeah, so I have a lot to say about that for sure. But I guess my work is to try to produce climate justice. And so like I'm a geographer who tries to do that in part through research, but I also try to do that IRL or whatever. So that's kind of like the broader project that I'm trying to think about. And the one very last thing that I'll say is I also study the politics of emotion and the way that emotion contributes to how we think about past, present, future, which I'm going to talk about when Levi asks us that question. But I'm really interested also in getting out of this feeling that I've been feeling for 10 or 15 years now, and like that dominates climate, you know, youth climate movements and other climate movement discussions about whether we should be despairing or whether we should feel hope. And I want to consider the ways today in which both of those are kind of like not maybe the most helpful ways of thinking about climate futures. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. I got to thinking about climate and climate justice through, in a sense, trying not to. You know, I studied social science in undergrad. I was involved in grad school in political organizing, but none of it was environmental or climate based. It was, I was in the graduate student union, graduate workers union. I was doing racial justice work, immigration justice work. And all of that was responding to conditions that were already in place. But as a graduate student, you know, with my book learning hat on, I guess, I was thinking on larger time scales, decades, you know, maybe even centuries, and trying to think, what are the things that make sense to push for in that sense? Things that are going to be here for years, situations that are going to be in place for years. And whenever I tried to do that on, you know, standard orthodox kinds of policy questions, you know, from a Pan-Africanist perspective, which is the team I play for, I guess, I would try to ask, you know, what trade policies make sense? What kind of public health interventions or attempts or frameworks make sense? Anytime I tried to answer those questions longer than a few years in the future, I kept running against a bunch of questions about the climate. Right? What is the climate going to be? What is the relationship as a result going to be between great powers and other countries? All these kinds of questions. And so eventually, I did that enough times. I hit my head against that wall enough times. I just thought, well, maybe I need to think about climate science and climate justice directly, and not just think about all these issues in isolation. Because can't really. So it turned out that the kind of things that Kai and Jamie work on turn out to be very central things that I needed to know, needed to think about, needed to learn about. So that was a kind of change in direction that came just a few years ago.
Yeah, thanks. It's really helpful, I think, to hear where y'all are all coming from and how we ended up here today. And I'd like to dig in a little bit more to the theme of past, present, and future now. And so one way to do this, I think, is to just ask if you can tell us a little bit more about how your work is oriented to the future. Do you see it as outlining possibilities, as actively intervening in the future, or as something else? And if you care to take this theme in another direction, feel free to. Would anybody like to take a first swing at it?
I can start. Okay. Yeah, so I work on climate adaptation specifically, which is, in best practice, going to be an anticipatory practice, not a hindcasting or reactionary kind of way of addressing climate change, right? But we'll anticipate in some way climate impacts and adapt to reduce harm preemptively, hopefully, right? But I think a lot of when I was reflecting on this question, a lot of what I've been writing is almost a rejection of a habit of thought and an escape route to the future with climate, and even in the adaptation field itself. And I guess I'd rather ground in this sense of nowness, which is an awareness of a deep, the longue durée, and what I was talking about in the Andes, what became so necessary to understand was a deep colonial history and present, right? And how it's manifesting in the present with the climate crisis. And so being in the nowness, I think, is key. It's holding all of that historical knowledge present as we take a step to the future. And it's not necessarily an escape route, but it's tending to what is present. And I think what I've really been writing on is really getting good relations in a nowness sense, relations with ourselves, relations with others, and relations with the earth. And I think if we kind of ground in that kind of space, perhaps that brings forward a different kind of, I would argue it does bring forward a better, more just future. And a lot of that is also grounded in knowledge of campesinos, and the way that they're orienting with time is not this linear past, present, future time, but a much more cyclical sense of time, right? So when I'm talking about climate impacts or what's happening today, a lot of it goes back to past state harms. It's just like agrarian reform. It's just like these other kind of state projects, right? And another kind of commodification and of the atmosphere is affecting their daily lives in similar ways that colonial projects, capitalist colonial projects have in the past. And that's the indigenous critique, is this is not new, but radical environmental change is this climate moment is colonialism deja vu, right? And so taking that more seriously, and also thinking with campesinos and their place-based adaptation strategies, I think makes me rethink our future and the way we respond, hopefully in a hopeless hope sense is what I've written on, is not to say that there is no vision for the future, but it's a radical acceptance of our present, and not a fear of the finitude, right? And I think that that's something that I learned from campesinos the most, learning in their ways of life. When the frost comes and it's abrupt and it's different and it's not timely, it's the wrong season and it ruins the harvest. It's not hysteria, it's let's tend to what remains, right? So turn over the soil and work with what remains. And care and ethics of care, I think, are really coming through that kind of that's what I'd like to bring forward into thinking about adaptation futures.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to disrupt the order and go next?
Well, can't turn down disruptive order. I guess the way that I think about, I'm a little more cloddy and mustache twirly than Jamie. I guess I'm a firm believer in plots. And I think the thing that I try to do with my work is less to make plots, but to, I guess maybe encourage people to do so, or make some kinds of plots obvious. But I think, I always think about something that Ruthie Gilmore said towards the end of Golden Gulag, which is her book about mass incarceration in California. And she has this section where she describes basically everything that she spent the whole book describing, which was all these different institutions that came together to plot out what came to be mass incarceration in California, then the largest system in the States. And her point was, or her way of driving this point home was, planning creates places, right? It's a feature of the kind of world that we built and the kind of scale of injustice that is now possible because of what the world is like now. That, the plots of some people become the literal living conditions of other people. And from my perspective, the question from there is, well, are tomorrow's living conditions going to be their plots or ours? And so that's kind of the ethos, I think.
Yeah, totally. And I think that one way that I might situate, not to try and cannibalize both of what you said, but to situate all of us in a discussion is to remind everyone that there are different versions of futures out there, and those futures are always under struggle. And so, for example, Jamie already referenced the kind of technocratic form of adaptation, which sees us, says that there are certain things that are changeable and certain things that aren't changeable. So we can't change the past, but we can prepare for tidal waves or whatever. So then we can have an adaptation policy that's going to do that. Which I think is similar to kind of, the thing that I was feeling in the early 2000s, which was a product of the 90s and 80s earlier, a reaction to a certain kind of technocratic environmentalism that said, there's no real alternative to this situation. We're at the end of history. All we can do is kind of tinker and build consensus and take baby steps and eventually pass some kind of climate policy. And it doesn't really matter if it's good or bad policy. It's just the first step, and then that's good enough. And so that's one kind of version of kind of their plot, another plot that's out there. And then there are the plots. Also, I like to remind people of this example because it's just so gooey, but firms and oil companies in particular also do all kinds of science fiction work. They just call it scenario planning and modeling instead of science fiction. But that's essentially what they're doing. And the kind of craziest example of this is the oil company Shell, who for over 50 years has been developing these kinds of futuristic scenarios in order to help them plan out how they can continue to extract oil, and in fact must continue to extract oil under whatever conditions the world throws at us. So you can go on their website, and these are public. They're not kind of dark room sort of things where they say this is how we're going to plan for what happens if there's a nuclear bomb, or what happens if climate change is bad, or what happens if whatever. And like, it's so funny because wouldn't you know it, that all of these scenarios at the end of the day, Shell still like exists and like makes profit. Like also these future stories tell us about pasts as well. You know, Shell is never culpable for climate change. Climate change is just a thing that sort of appeared out of the future as if by accident. And so like, let me give another example, sorry, to just kind of like give a few examples, but I'm getting a few out there helps us kind of like map out the different plots. We can also think of, I've been grappling with, and people have been getting mad at me online for not understanding at all, like why there's this kind of like somewhat popular surge among American environmentalists to try and get municipalities, states, and governments to declare a climate emergency. Which, and been getting feedback and / angry DMs or whatever, where, you know, in some ways people see this as a kind of baby step. In other ways, people see like the declaration of an emergency as a recognition that we're of the situation of the present, that like climate change is already here, like the house is already on fire, we should probably do something about it. But like, you know, where my sort of fear or hesitancy comes from is that like the sort of politics of emergency, of course, is also, there are institutions that already exist that are here to, you know, that are authorized by a politics of emergency, and they're not usually the best kinds of institutions, you know, so it's our militaries, our disaster relief, FEMA, which is, you know, perennially not particularly effective. It's, you know, charity institutions like the Red Cross and these kinds of things. And that's kind of the, you know, in any sort of situation of emergency, those are the kinds of institutions that are authorized to act. And in declaring a climate emergency, we say you do these things, but like we're actually saying in my analysis that we don't have the power to do these things, you know. And so it's kind of declaration of powerlessness. So I'm trying to think about how can we in the present sort of understand instead like our inheritances from the past and like all of the bad things and struggles and important movements and whatnot that we could, you know, talk for hours and hours and hours about, and understanding that the future is really scary and is like upsetting to think about, but also there are a wide array of things that could happen, and you know, we have to live with that uncertainty. And yet, like, is there a way we can still in the present do things that like grow our power and build our preparedness and whatnot, and acknowledge both that inheritance and that sort of uncertainty while still like not letting either of those things overwhelm us and like lead us to just being like twiddling our thumbs waiting for the apocalypse to happen because we've seen movies like that and they were kind of fun to watch or something. That just doesn't seem like a fun version of climate politics to me. So I don't know, I'm kind of going all over the place, but I just kind of am hoping that that's helpful in some ways to sort of orient our discussion. The last thing I'll say, I guess, is generically, rather than just like specifically, I think that when we're talking about future, we're always talking about ideology in some kind of way, because like the future doesn't actually exist. It's not written yet. So it's about our imagination of what future might look like. And our imaginations always feed into how we feel about the world and our power to, or capacity to do things in it, right? And so when we feel bad or like hopeless or despairing, that's in part a registering of our feeling of not having the power to enact like a transformative, socially just or economically redistributive or whatever else we, you know, that world that we would rather live in this one, which is alienating. And like, I'm sorry, like these robots on your campus are just like still in my head. I'm like, this is the world, like this is the world I don't want to live in. Robot campus. Anyway, now I know it's not the future, it's present. So nonetheless, like I'm not saying we just need to like go out and read science fiction and then we'll feel good or something like that. But like if we imagine a different future, if we imagine that different sorts of futures are possible and that they have to be built with others, that's how we grow our power and feel better about the world, by like actually being and acting in concert collectively in order to produce meaningful social change. And I would rather try to think about how we can grow our power than simply delegate that to institutions that maybe haven't been so effective at actually wielding it.
That's interesting and very helpful to hear all of your thoughts on that. And I wanted to ask a question about the environmental sciences, and this line of thought about plots is important for this question as well, right? Because the environmental sciences, maybe in a less acknowledged way, also tell us futures and are really important for how we understand climate futures. So I'm curious to hear, given that the environmental sciences are often seen as authorities on climate change issues, can you tell us a little bit about how your work engages with the environmental sciences, or how you personally engage with environmental scientists, whether in your work or your everyday, politics? I'll throw that to.
Can I actually disrupt that question a little bit and just
Sure.
like feed off of what they just were
Sure,
saying?
yeah.
Is that okay if we hold that question for just a second and like dig a little deeper?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to go back to this whole, like, and maybe it does connect, but to flaw in the power of narrative. We were really asked to kind of meditate on temporality, right? And I just, what I'm hearing and like what I feel like I would like to contribute is thinking of climate change, to name climate change is a temporal discourse, right? It is imbued with a temporal horizon. And I think that like a discourse, it is both inventing and governing its subjects. And so I think that, going to these states of exception when we have a temporality viewed in our climate discourse that is of our urgency and disaster and emergency we create a state of exception, which is very much what Kai already described, right? It's a moment of unbridled power for the state to do what's necessary for state interests, really. And we often see a harming of the most vulnerable people, right? And so I guess I get concerned both on that front, with that kind of temporal register in that discourse, when we have this urgency that opens up spaces for that kind of power, whether it's by the military or by ISE or whoever is going to operationalize that power on the ground, right, in the name of some sort of collective good, right? And then I'm also concerned very much with the way that I see it manifesting in the Andes, but other places, which is to use Johann Fabian's denial de coeval, right, who in anthropological writings and texts, infamously, anthropologists would write of the other, invent the other, and displace them to a period of the past, right? So contemporary communities, cultures, peoples, often indigenous societies, peoples, would be written about as a temporal figure located in some sort of primitive past or a historical way of being or not yet modern, right? And I think what climate change does in a popular discourse or in the dominant discourse of climate change is take the denial de coeval to a future casting instead of a hind casting. So I think it's writing about frontline communities as a problem of our future and denying the urgency and the immediacy of frontline communities today. So like I'm saying, in the Andes where I work, there is kind of a state of emergency recognized, but also this emergency is seen as something of the future, right? Glaciers aren't disappeared yet. They're supposed to disappear starting around 2050. And so a water scarcity crisis for the Andes region is to be of the future. Frontline communities, the campesinos, the descendants of Incas, right? They will be their front lines, but it's a problem of the future. The community I work in has already had a water scarcity issue because of climate change manifest, right? Decades ago. they've lost their trout, they've lost the bellwether species, right, the indicator species, the frogs. So they're already on the front lines of crime. They've been dealing with a water shortage. They have a water quality related to the glacier retreat issue of, at pH of 3. It's closer to battery acid than it is potable drinking water. And I can go into all the, geochemical of that, processes of that, but really it's an exposure of new bedrock, right? It's leaching out into their water systems. And so for an agricultural community, like that is a livelihood that is not sustainable in place anymore, right? And so we already have an infringement upon livelihood. We have that from 2 decades ago in this valley and no response. But it's a narrative in the future, right? And an imaginary on part of the state and disaster relief organizations that are future casting that this does not exist today, but this will be in the future, right? Because of the way they've already figured through models and other ways, the disappearance of water. And how that those kinds of discourses distort on the ground realities and really work with the erasure of certain peoples. Yeah. Sorry, so just again, kind of going home to the plot and narrative and just like the power of that. And I think that's to me where temporality really sits within climate change.
Yeah, the future is a site of struggle, and also the plot of the future is a site. Like, who gets to control the narrative about what the future is, right? Is it a site of hope? Is it a problem? Yeah.
And also, is it future?
Right.
It's already here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and the point, I think you, talking about the role of scientists and of geochemistry in this,
Right.
Maybe can connect us back to the question about the environmental sciences, in the sense that, again, the environmental sciences are seen as the authorities on climate change issues in a lot of cases. In this case, maybe, in defining what's future and what's present, or in defining the source of the cause of the water quality issue. So yeah, I'm curious to hear what others think about how you engage with the environmental sciences in your work. It seems like you draw from them, but are also challenging some of it, right? And how you engage with environmental scientists, if this can, I'd be curious to hear others' thoughts on this as well.
So I think this connects to Jamie's point. Correct me if I'm misunderstanding, but one of the things that issue is in general in climate science, climate politics is like who gets to define the content and scope of the problems, and in the first instance, what are the problems we're responding to in the first place? Is it what the glaciers and the hurricanes are doing? Is it our political institutions in the future? Is it what those political institutions happen in the past, the history of colonial expansion and state violence? All that seems on the table. And then I guess as Levi's question kind of points out, the current answer from the powers that be is a kind of narrow climate change is about the sky and carbon emissions, and we fix that, we fix the planet. And as a result of that, environmental science and related sciences have this kind of pride of place in figuring out what the problem is, what the scope of the problem is, what we're supposed to be responding to. So just to answer the question more directly, I definitely, environmental sciences are in the mix of what I respond to. Some of my academic work works with environmental sciences on the modeling side of things. So that's one of it's critical of how the modeling goes. But the broader thing that I would say is, I think, in the direction of what Jamie was saying, right, which is it's not even clear. It's not even clear to what extent we should be thinking about carbon emissions, as opposed to all these other richer descriptions of the social problems. You know, carbon emissions seem relevant, but you know, food sovereignty and water quality, all these other things that have much more complex explanations, particularly in parts of the world and in communities that have contentious histories with the state system. Those seem like they're likely to be in a lot of places more central to what it is that we should be up to. So yeah, the lesson that I take from this is that science is an activity like any other kind of activity, right? It has an organization, it has norms of how it goes and who gets to participate in it, right? Those of us who are here in this physical location, this institutional location, are closer to the levers of power and science than people elsewhere. But like any other domain of human activity, like any other thing that we do, we could do it differently. And so, you know, I think of the planning and plotting that we should be doing, an important piece of it is about science itself. Like, what does it even mean to study any of these issues? Why do we have a conception of studying these issues that is focused on carbon accounting as opposed to other things it could be focused on? And maybe just as importantly, why do we have a conception of scientific activity where so few people get to weigh in on a narrative that defines reality for so many? I think for me, that's a central issue, something that more environmental scientists would be sympathetic to than you might think.
Yeah, I think actually to jump off that, a lot of the problem isn't so much with science or scientists, but like the story about science right now, which is that we all have to believe and trust in it. So what does that mean? Like, believe the science? Like, there's not one science that's out there. There's many, many different kinds of sciences. And some of them are, you know, are we talking about climate science? Are we talking about like, you know, defense technology or something? Like, I don't want to believe in that. So, in any case, like, I know, sorry. I'm just thinking, again, like, not to make this, this is what I do, is my brain just goes to weird places. I'm just thinking about like yard sign politics and like the science that just say climate change is real. And like the idea that like the story of climate politics over the last 20 years is just between people who think that climate change is real and people who don't think that climate change is real. And like that story is like really, really simple and not accurate and like doesn't really take into account the production of denial and the different sorts of interests and experiences that might different folks might have with regards to climate change. It also doesn't take into account the fact that we're living in an ecological crisis, which is much bigger, as Debbie mentioned, than just climate change per se. And that Jamie mentioned as well, yeah. And so I guess I'm more interested in breaking it down and saying like, okay, how do we fold scientists who are really good at thinking about the complexity of situated problems into a movement that's actually about transforming things rather than just believing them? Like, how can they be political actors with us in some kind of like cool and interesting way? I actually don't, I stopped like paying attention to climate science annoyingly after the 2018 IPCC thing, which just said that like, you know, the scientists concluded that we would need like rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented transformations to all aspects of society. And I'm like, okay, cool, that's what I think too. You know, I'm glad you devoted a lot of time to come to that conclusion, and now what do we do? And scientists aren't so good at necessarily answering that now what do we do thing, but like they feel the kind of urgency and despair and like whatever longing to do something about it. So then I say like, okay, like scientists or students or environmental science students or whatever, let's just do that next step thing together and like say, what does this mean? You know, what are the implications? How do we get there? Like, how do we do this together? And like not so much worry about like whether we believe in the right science or the wrong science, or like have like completely coincident understandings of the crisis or moment we're living in, but like actually like start somewhere and figure out what different tools we have in our toolbox to do that kind of like planning or plotting or whatnot, all while never abdicating like the responsibility that we have to.
Yeah, thanks. And this point, I think about, how can scientists be political actors with, larger groups? How can climate justice use environmental science, transform environmental science? Leads to the last question that I wanted to ask. We have just a little over 5 minutes before we'll transition into Q&A. So I really wanted to get to this question. I'm glad we have a couple minutes. And this comes from, again, in Kai's book, something that he addresses explicitly is this question of thinking about which social groups can adequately respond to these problems, right? Which institutions, which groups, how do we form institutions and groups to adequately respond? So I'd be curious to hear others' thoughts on this as well. What are the challenges and opportunities of building power to address climate injustice? What do you see as if you can, in 5 minutes, give us a roadmap for some of the most promising groups, alliances, processes, and strategies that you think are important for moving towards climate justice? I'll throw it out to anybody.
I can say a couple of things. So, what are the obstacles? Capitalism. And not just because capitalism sucks and climate change sucks. So that's plenty. But I think there's a particular thing that happens because of capitalism, which is capitalism is, among the many other things that it is, it's a decision-making structure, right? People who sit on boards and who invest in companies have some measure of control over what happens in the whole sphere of economic life that pertains to that company. And it's a decision-making structure where shareholder value or profit, if you prefer, is going to explain the things that happen with respect to that thing, whether we're talking about the production of fossil fuels, whether we're talking about the provision of energy to homes, whether we're talking about the management of privatized utilities. And it's a short step from that to an explanation of political gridlock on changing our energy system and changing our political system to sustainable alternatives because of straightforward math. Show me the plan for revamping the world on which those stock prices across the board do better. I haven't seen one. None of Shell's science fiction authors have seen one. And so they don't do it. That's it. That's the whole ballgame. As long as that's the decision-making structure for how it is that energy is going to be produced and for whom it's going to be produced. Right here where we're at now politically is going to stay right here where we're at politically. So, what do we do? There's a lot of cool union organizing frameworks that challenge ways that these corporations and economic sectors make decisions, like the bargaining for the common good model of organizing, where workers bargain not only for wages and benefits, but for other aspects of their working conditions and how things run. Transnational organizing of social movements in general can challenge political structures, can challenge economic structures. So it has to be that scale of thing, and it has to move on that problem. Public control over aspects of economic life. Community control.
Yeah, I guess I'm inspired by like the Indigenous Women por Buen Vivir out of Argentina, the movement. I think that the movements that are able to articulate and mobilize around the climate crisis is a racial crisis, the colonial crisis, and a crisis of Eurocentric reason, I think are the most compelling, which means to me have the most, are really getting to, I guess, what I see as the fruits of the climate crisis, right? The most radical of the changes that we can bring about. And it is right, asking for a paradigm shift. It's not going to come through anything short of a paradigm shift and institutional change. But that's where I think I locate a lot of hope and inspiration. I see this coming from communities on the ground, organizing from African diasporas, Indigenous communities, the Chicano feminists, movements, and I find those probably the most aligned with my own kind of feminist Indigenous ethics in this discussion.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really powerful way to sort of end or wrap up the formal panel part. And we'd love to transition now into some Q&A from the audience, whether in person or on Zoom. If you have questions from Zoom, you can enter them in the chat, and we'll take some questions now.
I'll start. Thank you so much. This has just been such a thought-provoking and powerful discussion. And I wanted to pick up on some of the different threads and sort of put it back to you and ask you a question. I was really taken with Jamie's discussion of, well, first of all, her rejection of escape routes to the future, which seems like a really powerful and important formulation, and also being grounded in nowness. And I wanted to ask you all about strategies when on the one hand, there's clearly the sort of ultra local is central to in your formulation, Jamie, of like how we do this, and yet we're talking about a global scale here. And I think some of like obviously you're talking about capitalism and these sort of large global social formations. We're thinking about mass mobilization. So how do we put together like this sort of significance of like on the ground activism, sort of community activism with these sort of larger social movements in ways, and I guess like this is the piece of this that's hard, I think, is that requires a shared temporality. And I think that there isn't necessarily at this point a shared temporality. So I guess I'm asking you to think about scale, like how do we reconcile the differences in scale that are at work here? And finally, like the idea of plot is also a really compelling way to think about this. Plots, as you guys have all suggested, suggest a kind of progression, right? And yet we don't want this sort of the teleological approach here doesn't work, right? And so how do you construct a plot from the present that doesn't, like anyone writing a novel will tell you, you have to know the plot ahead of time. And yet here it's, I think, profoundly important that we don't, right? And so how do we do that? A lot of questions.
Yeah, I think the idea of knowing is, yeah, I agree. I just don't think that we can all be knowers right now. Visionaries, perhaps, the prophets, right, in the mix, but I don't know about this practice of knowing that we've all made a living on in the academy, right, about how much we know. I think turning that into, right, this practice of deep listening and learning to learn otherwise, really, I think is where I'd really like to see that kind of shift when we're thinking about the future, is to not use our habits of thought and these ingrained wisdoms that are assumed ways of reality, right? But to actually learn otherwise. I really think it's critical that we create the arts of imagining new futures. And what we often run up to is what is impossible, but we've only really thought about what's impossible because of a certain doctrine, right? And so I think thinking outside of that and really making the impossible possible, and there's some radical proposals out there that are so fantastic to read on, and like Natasha Myers, right, the ecofeminists. And I think this problem of scale, actually, I do work through the UNFCCC and follow the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform to the comprehensive parties as well. So I do work at the kind of the international level as well with Indigenous peoples. And it's the same struggle, it's the same thing. It's the same on the ground, it's the same there. It's problems of representation, participation, giving people stories in the dominant story, right, of what's happening. Voice, who has to speak, whose knowledge counts. Those are all like axes of, or I guess, parts of, I think for me, the climate justice issue for marginalized peoples, and how they're able to define and rights of self-determination for their futures, right? But I also think it connects to Femi's work and thinking not just, right, the work of the UN is like adaptation, how much is it going to cost, what's going to be the loss and damage, how much we're going to pay, right? It's all about mobilizing the kind of funds for the harm that we're going to ensue, right? Which to me is an awkward turn or a temporal turn on reparations. There's going to be harms to frontline communities, obviously, overwhelmingly the poor and communities of color, right? But we're willing to let that go. We'll just pay it up front. And I have a real problem with that logic, and I wonder, maybe at the level scale, how reparations, maybe thinking about what I mean by getting relations right in our present means also accounting for those historical atrocities, right? Which is Femi's book. So, I think that's what nowness for me looks like, instead of like, oh, let's just get it right in the future. It's like, I don't think so. I think maybe adaptation is about a past.
Any other thoughts from the panelists?
Oh, that was good.
I'll say that was good. I'll just say something quick about scale. I don't think you need to share the same temporality, right? So Huey Newton of the Black Panther Party once talked about revolutionary intercommunalism, which I take to mean to be talking about just connectivity, conscious, deliberate connectivity between local environments. So you could have a community control initiative over in Peru, you could have another one in Detroit, and they're talking to each other, learning from each other. And that's it. That's all that you need. You just need connection between different things that are happening. They don't have to be doing the same thing. They don't have to be doing versions of the same thing. They don't have to be following a centralized master plan. They just need mutual awareness. And the point that he was making wasn't all that theoretical. This was in the middle of a global wave of anti-colonial movements that followed the Second World War. And all of them did not have the same temporality. India was independent in 1947. Cape Verde was independent in 1975, right? They moved at different paces. They had different ideas. They involved different aspects of struggles. Some of these were literal wars. Some of these were diplomatic campaigns and nonviolent campaigns. But they all were aware of each other and helped each other out. And that's why each of them happened. And that model is one of the few models that we do have of change on this scale. And I think that's the kind of thing to think about when we think about potential change in response to climate crisis.
Yeah, and it's crazy. We have this thing called the internet now, which is like supposed to help enable that to happen, but we've all just decided to be sad on it. Well, we haven't decided this, it's decided for us to make us sad, but still, like, it's cool that like I can go to on like Saturday of next week, like Zoom session where people from Chiapas, Mexico, and people from Kurdistan and Rojava, like autonomous zone, are each going to talk about the ecological situations in these two different regions, and I'm like neither in either of them, but like can still learn from that and like be like, okay, like this is actually like cool or interesting, or this is the thing that I can, you know, understand and situate myself and whatever it is. So like, I don't know, it just seems like we can do internationalism in a way, like if they could do internationalism then, like we can do internationalism now. It shouldn't be this difficult. We just have to like actually commit ourselves to it and be like, this is a central plank of like who we are, is like part of a planetary struggle and not just like a struggle over getting our politicians to do the science or something. Just like different things.
Yeah, thanks. We have a question from Zoom now.
Yeah, so we do have about 50 people joining us on Zoom, so I just wanted to announce it, and it is an international audience, which is really exciting. So I'll go to a question here from Hannah, who's writing, what about generational crimes, i.e. infliction of devastating harms on younger people while extracting profits and by refusing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? So I think that ties in well with this idea of temporalities.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm still a young person, so like I get outraged by these things too. Like, yeah, and you know, there's some compelling like compelling writing and argumenting on this about like how do we consider the rights of future generations and how should the lives of humans and non-humans and humans of all different kinds and non-humans of all different kinds in the future, how should like they influence how we plan and whatnot. And so yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial and killer. And it's kind of like, I want to consider the way in which that might get us to weigh the perspectives of young people more, you know, rather than less in these discussions. I'm like so sick of, like, again, like I'm old, but I'm not that old, but like, I'm still so sick of all of these like, and it doesn't have to be a generational thing. I sometimes think we fit class politics into generational politics when really this is about like the fact that most young people do not have a lot of capital. And so we feel particularly powerless in the system. But like, to the extent that there is a generational aspect of it, I always want to say like, how do we get people to stop dismissing young people as being like idealistic or like, you know, not old enough, you haven't lived enough to like have a proper perspective or something like that. I'm just so sick of that like patronizing sort of thing, especially at the UN where they parade all these young people in and then like don't listen to them. You know, there's a fantastic YouTube clip you can watch of a young Maori woman giving a talk at the UN. She's the very last speaker and just like, you know, spitting fire at these like politicians, and then they're like, yeah, whatever, like we're just gonna do the thing. You know, but thanks for being here and giving us energy. I'm just kind of done with that. So.
You know, I think when I think about generations, I tend to think about planning horizons and different ways of thinking about, again, within the adaptation space. We have very, the modernist way of planning is, you know, kind of around kind of a mastery and control of time. And we think in maybe 30, maybe 50 year out time planning horizon windows, right? So the seawall should be good for 60 years tops, right? Things like that, which isn't much of a real future for the youth, right? But you know, indigenous models of adaptation take the 7th generation approach. So they're incorporating different time scales, right, into their time horizons and the way they're conceptualizing futures and planning for the future. And that's not new. That's not just climate planning, right? But that's kind of ancient practices. And so, yeah, I don't know how we tend best to generational concerns, but I know there's different models than what's basically dominant way we're doing it.
Yeah, in the interest of doing that, like, I would like to hear from some of the young people in the room, like questions that they have, or, you know, other sorts of ways in which you're hearing or vibing with or not vibing with whatever we're saying up here. That would be something I'm interested in.
2 questions. One, what are all your social medias? And 2,
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
oh, yeah, no problem. What are your social medias? And 2, how do we deal with leftist, environmentalist, whatever label you want to put on it? How do we deal with infighting?
Good question. So at Olufemi Otani. So yeah, it's just my name.
Take the easy question.
Yeah, yeah, I'm glad y'all can do that. I think infighting is good. Right? We have different relationships to the history that produce the present. We shouldn't expect that to be resolved just because we want to work together, right? That's not, it's gonna take more than that to deal with them, and we might not resolve everything. And all of that is fine. All that I think is even good. I think I prefer to think, what are the good kinds of conflict and what are the bad kinds? The bad kinds produce sectarianism and moralizing and cause our power to contract rather than expand. I think those are bad kinds of conflict. The good kinds of conflict clarify boundaries, lead to new ideas, weed out bad ones, or at least identify incompatibilities, and those things are all good. So yeah, that's what I was saying.
Yeah, like another classic Ruth Gilmore-ism is like, she would say in like prison abolition struggles, we don't all have to believe the same thing to go part of the way for a little while. We don't have to like hash out like the world and like make sure that all of our individual like proclivities are like coincident in order to work on a thing for a while together. And like that thing can end, and it can end, and then we build like new coalitions and whatever, and that's totally fine. I think that like there's a way, there's a way that part of the kind of story of technocratic, neoliberal environmentalism or whatever, it was a story about consensus, about saying we all have to agree on what we're going to do, and the way that we get everyone to agree is to find the lowest common denominator, which is essentially just turns into some sort of policy adjustment that is supposed to help business, politicians, and maybe some people, and that's the consensus version of things, which is why we've only seen like little tweaks in, coming out of that movement with regards to climate change and environmental politics more generally. So if we don't want to have a lowest common denominator of politics, we have to accept that sometimes we're going to have like irreconcilable differences, and that those differences matter. It's not that they don't matter, but like how can we figure out how to still work together and be comradely and be and not let it like consume us, while also recognizing that we can diverge as well, and sometimes that divergence is okay. We're going to work on different projects for a while, and maybe those projects are loosely connected or not connected or whatever, but like they're still part of the repertoire or like I don't know, like I don't have the metaphor. I'm just thinking about like a kind of like abrasive but like still enjoyable punk band or something like that, right? Where it's sort of like isn't like harmonizing but like still makes sense, kind of. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, I think both those are spot on, and I think going up with like divergence.
Oh, I forgot.
Wait.
We can do social media.
My thing's just my name too. Sorry.
My name as
So
well,
sorry.
yeah, Jamie. Yeah. I think that, I just could refer you to maybe some literature on the STS, feminist STS and their writings on commoning and uncommoning, right? It's the enclosure and the idea of the commons is kind of a colonial-like notion. I think getting at this consensus, right? And all sharing the same, right? And these kind of meta visions and meta narratives. And actually it's the frictions, the divergences, I think that are really great in kind of getting, finding alliances, right? And building those coalitions and refining ideas that maybe weren't such good ideas, right? But maybe were a first step. I think about the feminist movement, right? And then having it push back from feminists of color who were excluded from, the 70s movements. Having kind of, I think a commoning, right? The idea of divergence is that we have a shared element in common. To diverge, you have to converge somewhere, right? So hopefully we're converging on this shared, some sort of goal or something at the core that's holding us in common. But having divergent methods, diverging is not a problem.
Yeah, but like, and I'll just say one last thing. Part of it also is just like getting off the internet at least for a little while, because like the internet doesn't help, and like it can help, and like whatever. And I like the internet. I'm not poo-pooing it, or I am kind of, but like, I also think that a lot of times and like the pandemic has melted my brain in this way, where I forget how much better it is to be in rooms with people, where your first impulse isn't to like, scream at someone, hopefully. And that like then maybe we can work out our differences together and like still do something productive and not let it not drop out, because that's like burnout is kind of like the other sort of option here, where we just go, well, can't do anything, I'm just gonna go home and post, and that's not a solution.
I think that this is a really also useful conversation in the space of knowledge production around climate change, right? And what you were asking us earlier is how we engage with environmental sciences, or and there are some that from a critical paradigm, I am incommensurable to working with a very positivist approach. I find an incommensurability there, but then I can work across others, right? Because we converge on fundamental ontological core beliefs, I think.
Zoom again?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's come out of the panel, I think, is that the future is now, in a way, whether it's the climate emergency or the robots on campus, like that's been coming up again and again in your conversation. So we have a question from Meher Rose that says, how climate justice can be done to directly affect countries like Bangladesh that have been long suffering some severe cyclones? So this idea that like things are already happening, there's already climate emergency, more serious in certain parts of the world. So do you have thoughts on that?
So, I mean, this is kind of, climate reparations, as lots of people have talked about, is one way of thinking through this. Loss and damage as a policy conversation is what's been cooked up on the international level as what you do after disaster. It's severely underfunded, so they could fund it more, right? There could be more resources for community-based adaptation. These are all things that make sense. But from my perspective, the way to think about this sort of thing is really a reconstructionist, make the world over again kind of perspective. Because that's really the scope of what we're talking about in the explanation of who's vulnerable, why they're vulnerable, and what the problem even is that we're trying to solve. and I think, Jamie was saying this really nicely earlier, but, the history of the ecology, the political institutions, the economic history of places, like Bangladesh, like elsewhere, is just shot through and through with all of the things that explain the rest of our world. And it's a project of that kind of scope to respond to those sorts of things. It's good to move dollars around, to change some lines on the balance sheet, but I don't think we're one weird policy trick away from responding to a literal planetary scale political problem.
Yeah, I mean, all I'll add to that is like one of the things that if you are, and I don't know where this person is, but like if you are in the quote unquote global north countries in like richer parts of the world that like built that wealth through colonial extraction, a good first step is always like listening to people and figuring out ways that you can listen to people and read people who are in the places that you're concerned about and listen to what their demands are and like how they figure, how they understand the climate crisis, how they understand its connections to coloniality, to capital accumulation, to race and racism or gender difference or whatever else, right? And use that as a first step rather than, okay, I think that sometimes, and I don't know if this is particular to American, but like Americans sometimes, United States Americans sometimes exemplify this where their impulse is to go, okay, like I'm concerned about Bangladesh or climate refugees or whatever. How can I in my head develop the solution at the level of the United Nations right now and just go like straight there, go straight from like your concern for those people there to some other institution over there without actually taking the time to like listen and learn and understand like the deep and complex causes of vulnerability and whatnot, without having any sort of mistake. Which isn't to say that like you can't care about like climate refugees or borders or migration or whatever if you live in Virginia. It's just to say that like in order to build any sort of solidarity or justice, like you actually might have to change yourself and your opinions about where these problems arise from. And like that's kind of like what solidarity is. It's kind of building like interest in others through and like commitment to others like beyond kind of like your understanding of your individuality or class or position in the world. So yeah, you should do more than listen as well, but also listening is like an important component that oftentimes gets forgotten in this kind of super big like other side of the planet sort of.
I just want to add something real quick. Cash money, like, we love to complicate shit because that's our job. But really, like, just following up on this idea, it's not like the US is the place where ideas come from and we export them, right? The US is the place where dollars accumulate and we hoard them. That's our role in the global economy. And in fact, like a lot of places, Bangladesh is a great example. They have a like cyclone management social apparatus that we should be emulating, right? We don't know how to do that, right? They do. What people don't have in lots of the world are the resources to expand the things that they already know how to do. And so, this is a little self-criticism. I jumped right to the philosophical point. Oh, we need to remake the world, but like, we need to break people off with some money. Like, that's not all of it, but it's like 70% of it. So yeah, I want to make sure not to leave that aside. And just going with the listening thing, there is the Caribbean Reparations Commission 10-point plan, right, where they call for debt cancellation, which would help place in the Caribbean, which would help Bangladesh. There is Pacto Ecosocial del Sur, right, that has a solidarity plan for a solidarity economy in Latin America. Like, these things exist. Small island developing states have said these are the things that we would need from the international system to, make sure people in the Marshall Islands can take care of themselves, et cetera, et cetera. So these things are out there. Give them what they need.
And yet to complicate that. No, totally with Femi on that, but I do think that there's almost an overstated importance on money. Again, working in the Andes, not necessarily a cash economy. How are we, what does loss and damage look like there, right? And I'm really concerned with the overlooking of non-economic loss and damage, which, grief, loss, death, family members, ecological systems. And then, I think with something like loss and damage to be given a buyout, I am concerned it's almost like, that afterlives of plantations, right? Or in the wake of in this country and in agrarian reform across America, given this land or this cash to make a way out of no way, right? And I really am concerned with that setup for our future, quote, vulnerable communities.
That's a good point. We have time for one more audience question, or is it?
Was there an audience question here?
Exactly on half hour. We can take.
All right, let's just take you and then, okay, one more question.
Yeah, this question is for me. Like, how much pressures on migration, like the water crisis is like causing there in the Andes? Would you consider that like another way of adapting to the climate crisis? But and for everyone, like, what is your take on like the climate refugees that you were mentioning? This is like how we can foresee a future of a climate disaster is going to impact on like migration. What are like the worst possible scenarios for that? That include probably some antagonistic view of security from the global north towards like these moving communities. And
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so in the Andes in particular, it's definitely expediting whatever out-migration was already happening, right? So campesinos will say things like, well, time itself is changing. And part of that is some sort of recognition of this kind of, urgency, this kind of intensity in the time. It's all tied up to migration is a perfect example, right? Instead of a slow out migration, all of a sudden there's kind of a mass out migration of the youth from the communities, right? And so this really complicates harvest, complicates planting, this complicates the whole way of life and the social fabric. And no, I see migration as, I know the UN discourse, right, the IPCC categorizes it as a failure to adapt. I think that's, again, a very Western kind of colonial idea when historically communities have adapted to harsh environments by migration. But prior nation states, right, it becomes problematic for nation states. So yeah, it's a failure to adapt, but really being mobile and being able to migrate in that way, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it is a strategy and one of our most ancient strategies of adaptation as human species. So I don't see it as a failure, but I do see it as forced displacement. I don't think this is a choice, and that's a problem. That's a refugee status. Yeah.
So the point I have to make is a little bit of a downer. Maybe Pat, you'll have something.
Oh yeah, I've got the no. I was just thinking about how I teach a Scots College Borders and Migration in time of climate crisis, and one of the things that oftentimes shocks people in the early part of this course is that like the institution that in the United States government that has most recognized and most responded to climate change is the Pentagon. And like the Pentagon has done so by developing scenarios for what would they do if there was like a migrant caravan or something that came to the US border, and how would they deploy their, coordinate institutionally with ISE, with local law enforcement, deploy their troops and whatever. They've done like, they do exercises on this and this kind of thing as well. And so like there's a way that like the story of the climate emergency gets folded into security institutions in the United States government really, really easily, in a manner that doesn't actually, has very little care for the causes of migration, be they climate or imperialism, capital accumulation, or whatever combination of these exists in different parts of the world, but like really sees itself as a solution, or as like needing to prepare by through everything from technology transfer to infrastructure walls and whatnot to whatever else. So what can we do instead of that is, in part, kind of, I sort of think requires a more, there's strangely not much interest in the already existing refugee politics networks amongst climate activists. They really like to talk about climate refugees, but aren't always interested in listening to folks who have been doing various different kinds, everything from humanitarian aid to border justice and migrant and refugee, again, everything from legal services to mutual aid groups to political organizing and whatnot, along that sort of realm of things. So, that's just what I see in a place like Virginia, and in Minneapolis as well, where it was also really important to organize events that brought together Native nations and migrants and understand the co-evolutionary perspectives that worked to oppress both. And I don't know, there's a lot more that I could say about this, which is why I teach a class on it. I would always like answer this question by always, again, sort of going to maybe the not downer answer is, the need to listen to people who are already.
Here's the downer answer. There's planning happening around this, and it is almost exclusively on the right. So, the massive detention center network that we already have, thanks mass incarceration, in the US is just one example of a larger global phenomenon, which is the expansion of tens of billions of private sectors in private military, border surveillance technologies, and related economic sectors. The people contributing to this include, or the organizations contributing to this include asset managers, so the largest economic formations in human history. And they also include the political elites of right-wing parties across the world, in the global north, in the global south. It's all bad, really. And, I wish I had something other than that to say about it, but I don't. So that's where we're at with climate migration. And with migration in general, like Kai pointed out, it's not as though this is the only set of reasons that people migrate, or this is the only set of people who do migrate who are going to meet border violence. Right? That this is the global system of border violence. Yeah.
And the environmental migrants are not recognized, right, under international law as refugee status. So I think we need to, if there was something that I would rally behind, it's probably mobilizing something like migration as a basic human right, right? I think we've got to protect our right to migrate and to be mobile. And I think that this is kind of doing away with institutions and getting at this kind of reconstruction, this project of like, we've got to rethink the nation state. This is not going to work for us in the future. Well, it'll work for you, right?
But the last point I want to make is just, the way that the system responds to migration is, as we all know, partly because of who's migrating.
Super racialized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The global policy shifted towards warehousing in a process that intensified after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this is powerfully on display now as people having to flee Ukraine face very different situations than people who before had to flee Syria and people who right now would have to flee Ethiopia. So, that's going to be a fundamental aspect of the politics of movement for the rest of the century. And as far as I can tell, we don't have good answers to what to do about this. Not intellectually, definitely not institutionally, but we need some.
Maybe we can close with a call to learn and think more about this. Because a crucial point. Thank you all for joining. I think we need to wrap it up, but thanks to everybody.
Well, so much for this really important discussion. Thank you to our audience in the room for coming, and thank you to our Zoom audience for being attentive and for asking a lot of questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer all of them. Thank you for coming, and we'll hopefully see you all at future events.
Okay. Yeah, we're done.
That's a great
That was cool.
Yeah.
Crazy good thoughts. Nice to be on.
Yeah.
Thank you.